April 12, 1967, Ashau Valley, Vietnam. The ambush lasted 8 seconds before Private Danny Kowalski's M16 stopped firing. Not empty, jammed. Around him, 3 more rifles clicked silent while the jungle erupted with AK fire. The weapon that was supposed to make them invincible had just become a paperweight. 2 years earlier, Pentagon generals had promised this rifle would end the war. Lightweight, devastating, the future of infantry combat. The North Vietnamese had feared it at first, reorganizing entire tactics around its terrifying rate of fire. But somewhere between the promise and this moment, something had gone catastrophically wrong. What turned America's space-age rifle into a death trap? And how did soldiers survive long enough to fix it? If you want the full story of triumph, disaster, and redemption, subscribe to our channel for more untold chapters of war. The fluorescent lights of the Pentagon briefing room cast sharp shadows across Robert McNamara's face as he lifted the black rifle above his head. March 1963. The Secretary of Defense held it with one hand, effortless, theatrical, 6 pounds 4 ounces. The M14 rifle leaning against the wall behind him weighed 11 pounds fully loaded. The contrast spoke louder than statistics. Gentlemen, McNamara's voice carried the certainty of an engineer solving an equation. The future has arrived. Around the mahogany table sat 24 military officers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed contempt. The old guard. Men who'd carried Garands across Europe, who'd frozen with M1 carbines in Korea. They knew the weight of wood and steel, the reliability of proven designs. This black plastic thing looked like a toy, but McNamara had numbers. He always had numbers. Eugene Stoner's AR-15 design fired a .2223 caliber round at 3,250 feet per second. The high-velocity projectile tumbled on impact, creating devastating wound channels that dropped enemy soldiers instantly. In controlled tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the rifle had performed flawlessly. Accuracy at 300 yards exceeded the M14. Recoil was minimal. Even smaller soldiers could control automatic fire. And a rifleman could carry 3 times the ammunition for the same weight. The generals watched footage from Army trials. Targets shredded. Watermelons exploded. Ballistic gelatin blocks showed horrific temporary wound cavities. One officer whispered that it wasn't sporting. Another pointed out that war wasn't supposed to be sporting. The skeptics raised familiar objections. The small caliber lacked stopping power. The direct gas impingement system was too delicate for field conditions. Plastic furniture would crack in cold weather. The rotating bolt might jam with dirt. These were men who believed in over-engineering, in weapons that could be buried in mud and still fire. McNamara dismissed each concern with data. The lethality statistics were undeniable. The rifle had passed environmental testing. Maintenance requirements were actually lower than the M14, and the cost, significantly cheaper to manufacture at scale. The Pentagon's accountant king saw elegance and efficiency. What no one mentioned in that briefing room was the quiet compromise already made. To meet McNamara's cost projections, certain specifications had been altered. Chrome-lined chambers, which Stoner insisted prevented corrosion and easing extraction, were deemed unnecessary. The ammunition propellant was changed from IMR powder to ball powder, cheaper, more readily available. These seemed like minor technical adjustments. They would prove catastrophic. By December 1964, the first M16 rifles arrived in South Vietnam. Not standard issue yet, special operations units, advisors, elite airborne troops. The soldiers who received them felt like they'd been handed something from a science fiction film. Compared to the brutal, club-like M14, the M16 felt alive in their hands, responsive, modern. The weapon that would end the war, they said. No one was laughing yet. November 14th, 1965. Ia Drang Valley. The Central Highlands erupted with a violence that would redefine American understanding of this war. Lieutenant Jack Dittrich hefted his M16 as the Hueys descended toward landing zone X-ray. Around him, soldiers from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, gripped their new rifles with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. Half the unit still carried M14s. The other half had drawn M16s from supply just 2 weeks earlier. They'd zeroed them at base camp, fired maybe 100 rounds each. Now they were landing in Elephant, grass with North Vietnamese regulars dug in 300 yards. Away. The first shots came before the skids touched ground. Dittrich hit the dirt and brought the M16 to his shoulder. Across the clearing, muzzle flashes sparked from the tree line. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked, barely. A gentle push against his shoulder. The cyclic rate was astonishing. 20 rounds downrange in 3 seconds. Controlled bursts. The way they'd trained. Through the chaos, he watched tracers converge on a fighting position. The North Vietnamese soldier there tried to return fire, then jerked backward as if yanked by invisible wire. The M16's rounds didn't punch neat holes. They tumbled, yawed, fragmented. Hydrostatic shock radiated through tissue like a shockwave. All around landing zone X-ray, the same scene repeated. M16-equipped soldiers laid down, fire that was fundamentally different from anything the NVA had encountered. Volume? Accuracy? Lethality? The high-velocity rounds zipped through bamboo and vegetation that would deflect heavier bullets. Soldiers who'd struggled with the M14's climb during automatic fire found they could actually control the M16. Suppress, maneuver, advance. By nightfall, the perimeter held. Barely. The battle would rage for 3 more days, but in those first hours, the M16 made believers out of skeptics. The North Vietnamese learned hard lessons in that valley. Captured documents later revealed their tactical reassessment. One NVA after-action report, translated by Army intelligence, described American firepower as unprecedented, in volume and effect. Another noted that soldiers armed with the black rifle could sustain fire rates previously only achievable with crew-served weapons, the psychological impact cut deeper than bullets. NVA soldiers were disciplined, experienced, often veterans of wars against the French and Japanese. They understood infantry combat. But the M16 killed differently. The wound patterns were grotesque, massive temporary cavities, explosive trauma. Soldiers hit center mass died almost instantly from hydrostatic shock, their internal organs liquefied. The weapon's signature sound, a sharp, rapid crack rather than the deeper bark of an AK-47, became associated with mass casualties. Word spread through the guerrilla networks. The Viet Cong, who relied on ambush tactics and quick engagements, found their calculus shifting. Closing with American units meant facing fire that could chew through entire squads in seconds. The M16's effective range overlapped perfectly with jungle combat distances, 50 to 200 yards, where most firefights occurred. Private First Class Jimmy Nakayama, one of the M16-equipped troops at Drang, wrote home 3 weeks later. His letter, preserved in the Army Heritage Collection, captured the weapon's early promise. This rifle is something else. Light enough I forget I'm carrying it. Mean enough that Charlie doesn't forget when I use it. Some of the old-timers say it's too fancy, won't hold up. But out here it works. By early 1966, demand for M16s skyrocketed. Units that had them refused to give them up. Units that didn't have them submitted urgent requests. The Pentagon accelerated production orders. Colt's manufacturing plants in Hartford ran 3 shifts. The M16 wasn't just a rifle anymore. It was becoming mythology. NVA commanders responded with tactical adaptations. Standoff distances increased. Ambush kill zones were extended. Orders circulated to concentrate fire on soldiers carrying the black rifles. Eliminate the M16 gunners first. Some units began scavenging American weapons when possible, recognizing their superiority. But something else was happening, invisible and insidious. As production ramped up, quality control measures compressed. The changed ammunition specifications, ball powder instead of IMR powder, created higher chamber pressures and accelerated carbon fouling. The deleted chrome lining meant extraction became dependent on pristine conditions. And the lack of cleaning kits, deemed unnecessary because the rifle was self-cleaning, left soldiers ignorant of basic maintenance. The rifle that had dominated at Ia Drang was not quite the same rifle flooding into Vietnam by late 1966. Across the Pacific, another lesson was unfolding, one that would transform confidence into catastrophe. April 1967. The monsoon arrived early that year. Rain swept across South Vietnam in gray curtains, transforming red clay roads into rivers of mud and turning the jungle into a steam bath. Humidity climbed above 90% and stayed there. Soldiers wrapped their rifles in plastic ponchos during movement, stripped them down at night, tried to keep moisture out of mechanisms that seemed to attract it magnetically. That's when the M16 began to die. The first reports came from scattered units across I Corps. A rifle here, 2 rifles there. Failure to extract, spent brass stuck in the chamber, refusing to eject. Soldiers would fire around, pull the trigger again, nothing. The bolt locked on an empty case that wouldn't budge. Or worse, a double-feed jam, where a fresh round tried to chamber behind a stuck case, wedging the action completely shut. Company commanders initially attributed it to user error. Green troops who didn't know their weapons. Sloppy handling. The M16 had been sold as practically maintenance-free, a self-cleaning marvel of engineering. Most soldiers had never received cleaning kits because none had been issued. The Army's technical manuals barely mentioned cleaning procedures, but the failures accelerated. 10% malfunction rate in some platoons. 20% higher, Ashau Valley. April 12, 1967, Alpha Company 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry walked into a horseshoe ambush at dawn. The North Vietnamese had positioned themselves perfectly, 3 sides, interlocking fields of fire, escape routes blocked. They waited until the American column stretched thin, then opened fire with everything they had. Private Danny Kowalski went prone and brought his M16 up, squeezed the trigger. 3 rounds, 4, 5, then nothing. The rifle went dead in his hands. He pulled the charging handle, locked. He slapped the magazine. Nothing changed. Around him, other soldiers were screaming the same realization. Jam! My rifle's down. I can't clear it. Sergeant Mike Torres watched 8 of his 12 riflemen go from effective to helpless in the first 30 seconds. The ones with M14s kept firing. The ones with M16s became casualties or frantically worked malfunction drills they'd never been properly taught. Torres himself carried an M16. It fired 6 rounds before the bolt locked forward on an empty chamber that wasn't empty at all. The ambush lasted 11 minutes. 7 Americans died, 14 wounded. After-action reports would later note that several soldiers had been killed while attempting to clear jammed rifles, unable to return fire while enemy rounds found them. The survivors found something haunting when they examined their weapons. The chambers were filthy, caked with carbon residue, as if the rifles had fired thousands of rounds instead of hundreds. The brass cartridge cases showed extraction marks, deep gouges where the bolt had tried to rip them free and failed. What they didn't know was that the problem wasn't in the valley. It was in the ammunition. Back in the United States, Army Ordnance investigators were beginning to piece together a catastrophic supply chain failure. The M16 had been designed around a specific propellant, IMR powder, which burned clean and produced consistent chamber pressure. Eugene Stoner had tested every component around this specification, but IMR powder cost more than alternatives. When production ramped up to meet Vietnam demand, Army procurement officers made what seemed like a reasonable substitution. Ball powder, used in other military ammunition, readily available, significantly cheaper. What they failed to test adequately was how ball powder behaved in the M16's direct gas impingement system. The rifle worked by bleeding high-pressure gas from the barrel back into the bolt carrier, cycling the action. Ball powder burned hotter and faster than IMR powder. It increased cyclic rate from 750 rounds per minute to over 1,000. It produced far more carbon residue. And critically, it created higher chamber pressures that made extraction more difficult. This alone might have been manageable, but there was a second failure, equally damaging. Eugene Stoner's original design specified chrome-lined chambers and barrels. The chrome provided a slick, corrosion-resistant surface that allowed spent casings to extract smoothly even under adverse conditions. It was standard in quality military firearms. Colt and the Army, under pressure to reduce costs and accelerate production, eliminated chrome lining. The decision saved approximately $4 per rifle, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of weapons. The savings looked impressive in Pentagon spreadsheets. In the humid hell of Vietnam, it was a death sentence. Unlined chambers corroded microscopically in the moisture. Carbon buildup from ball powder fouling bonded to the rough steel. Brass cases, expanded by high chamber pressure, stuck to the fouled surface. The extractor couldn't generate enough force to pull them free. The rifle wasn't broken. It was sabotaged by cost-cutting and bureaucratic indifference. By May 1967, failure rates in some Marine units at Sanh approached 40%. Soldiers began carrying 2 rifles, one to use until it jammed, one to switch to. Others scavenged AK-47s from dead Viet Cong, trusting the enemy's weapon more than their own. The psychological damage was immeasurable. Combat effectiveness collapsed when riflemen couldn't trust their rifles. Letters home told the story that official reports tried to hide. One Marine corporal wrote, "They gave us a toy and told us it was a weapon. Now guys are dying because their rifles quit working right when they need them most. I'd rather carry an M14 that weighs twice as much and works every time." The transformation from triumph to catastrophe had taken 18 months. The rifle that North Vietnamese forces had feared now gave them tactical advantage. American units, technologically superior on paper, found themselves outgunned by peasant guerrillas with 50-year-old Soviet designs. Someone would have to answer for this. But first, more soldiers would have to die. Hill 8081 South. Sanh, May 2nd, 1967. The hill rose 900 feet above the surrounding jungle, its slopes covered in elephant grass and scattered bomb craters from B-52 strikes. Second Lieutenant Timothy Bradford led his platoon up the western approach in 100-degree heat, each man carrying 60 pounds of gear and dread. Intelligence said the North Vietnamese had abandoned the position. Intelligence was wrong. The first mortar rounds landed at 14:20 hours. Bradford hit the ground as shrapnel whined overhead. His Marines scattered into whatever cover existed. Shallow depressions, dead logs, the inadequate shadow of scrub brush. Return fire came immediately. Disciplined, accurate. The NVA had let them climb into the kill zone before springing the trap. Suppress that tree line, Bradford shouted, pointing to muzzle flashes 200 yards upslope. His Marines opened fire. For approximately 30 seconds, the hillside thundered with outgoing rounds. Then the character of the battle changed. Jam! "I'm down. Won't extract." Bradford watched his platoon's firepower collapse in real time. Corporal Danny Wu yanked his charging handle, face twisted in frustration. Private first class. Rodriguez slapped his forward assist. The mechanism didn't exist yet on these early M16s. Lance Corporal Matthews tried to mortar his magazine out, clearing a double feed, while bullets kicked up dirt inches from his head. Out of 32 riflemen, 13 had functioning weapons. 13. The Marines fought with what they had. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, whose M16 had jammed on the second magazine, picked up an AK-47 from a dead NVA soldier killed in earlier fighting. The irony wasn't lost on him, using the enemy's rifle because his own had betrayed him. 2 other Marines did the same, scavenging communist weapons to stay in the fight. The ones with jammed rifles weren't helpless. They'd learned the malfunction drill through brutal repetition. 10 steps, performed under fire while your friends died around you. 1. Slap the magazine to ensure it's seated. 2. Pull the charging handle to the rear. 3. Observe the ejection port. 4. If the case is visible, use a cleaning rod or knife tip to pry it free. 5. Strip the magazine. 6. Clear the chamber. 7. Inspect for damage. 8. Reload. 9. Chamber around. 10. Resume firing. In training, this took maybe 20 seconds. Under fire, with hands shaking and adrenaline spiking, it took forever. And it often didn't work. The stuck brass wouldn't budge. The fouled chamber held tight. Private Marcus Webb knelt behind a termite mound, working his rifle with the methodical desperation of a man who knew his life depended on metal and springs-obeying physics. His cleaning rod, one of the few in the platoon, traded from a Navy corpsman who'd bought civilian supplies, bent as he tried to punch the stuck case free. Sweat poured into his eyes. His hands, slick with gun oil and humidity, kept slipping. 30 yards away, Lance Corporal Deshaun Miller's rifle had jammed 3 times. He'd cleared it twice. The 3rd time he gave up, fixed his bayonet instead. The blade locked into place with a click that felt absurd given the volume of fire raking the hillside. But it was something, steel that wouldn't fail. Bradford tried to call for fire support, but his radio operator was down, hit in the first volley. The platoon was pinned, outgunned, and losing cohesion. The North Vietnamese, recognizing the Americans' predicament, intensified their assault. They knew. Whether through captured rifles, interrogated prisoners, or simple observation, they knew the M16 failed under these conditions. The psychological collapse was worse than the tactical disadvantage. These were Marines, trained to believe in their equipment, their training, their fundamental superiority. The M16 had been sold as a technological leap forward, a weapon that would make them unstoppable. Instead, it made them victims. Bradford watched Private First Class Kowalski, different kid, same name as the soldier from Ashau, trying to clear his rifle for the 4th time. The private's face showed something Bradford had never seen in combat before. Not fear, not even anger, betrayal. The weapon had become the enemy. Fix bayonets, Bradford ordered. If the rifles wouldn't fire, they'd fight with what remained. Blades, grenades, fists, if necessary. The order went out across the hillside. 20 Marines locked bayonets onto rifles that had become expensive clubs. The sound, that definitive click of steel meeting steel, carried a medieval finality. At 15-12 hours, Navy F-4 Phantoms screamed overhead. Bradford's radio man, the backup, a lance corporal who'd grabbed the PRC-25 from his dead friend, had managed to get through to battalion. The aircraft dropped napalm danger close, 100 yards from the Marine position. The jungle exploded in orange flame and black smoke. The North Vietnamese pulled back. Not routed, not defeated. Tactically withdrawing, because the Americans had called in fire they couldn't match. But on the ground, soldier to soldier, the NVA had won. Final count, 6 Marines dead, 19 wounded. Rifle malfunction rate, 42%. 14 M16s, so fouled they required armorer-level maintenance to restore function. 3 rifles damaged beyond field repair, their chambers corroded and action seized. That night, the survivors sat in their fighting positions and cleaned their weapons with whatever they had. T-shirts, bootlaces. One Marine used his toothbrush, scrubbing the bolt carrier with bristles worn soft. They didn't have proper cleaning kits. Command hadn't issued them because the rifle was supposed to be self-cleaning. Staff Sergeant Hayes field-stripped his M16 by moonlight and stared at the carbon buildup caked in the bolt carrier. Black, crusty, thick as paint. He'd fired maybe 200 rounds that day. The rifle looked like it had fired 2,000. This thing's supposed to be the future, he said to no one in particular. Future's gonna get us all killed. 20 years later, Hayes would testify before a congressional committee. His voice, steady and controlled, would describe Hill 881 South in clinical detail. But in the hearing room, observers would notice his hands, the way they trembled when he held the photograph of his platoon, 7 faces circled in red. Men who died trying to clear jammed rifles while the enemy advanced. We didn't lose faith in each other, Hayes would say into the microphone. We lost faith in America. The hill was eventually taken. Reinforcements arrived. Air support pounded the NVA positions into scorched earth, and Marines planted the flag on the summit. But the victory tasted like ash. Every man who'd been on that slope knew the truth. They'd survived in spite of their rifles. Not because of them. June 15th, 1967. Room 2154, Rayburn House Office Building. Washington, D.C., Congressman James J. Howard of New Jersey gavelled the hearing to order. The Special Subcommittee on the M16 rifle program had convened after months of stonewalling bureaucratic delay and mounting casualties. Rows of witnesses sat along tables facing the committee. Colt executives, Army procurement officers, ballistics experts. And in the back, a handful of Marines flown in from Vietnam, still gaunt from combat. The air conditioning hummed against the Washington summer heat, but the room felt stifling. Howard shuffled his papers and began, "Gentlemen, we are here to determine why American soldiers are dying with jammed rifles in their hands." The opening statements tried to deflect. Colonel Harold Yunt, Chief of Infantry Weapons at the Pentagon, attributed malfunctions to inadequate training and improper maintenance. He displayed charts showing that in controlled tests, M16 reliability exceeded 95%. The implication was clear. The rifle wasn't the problem. The soldiers were. Then came the letters. Congressman Richard Eichord of Missouri had collected dozens of them, correspondence from soldiers in Vietnam to their families, forwarded to congressional offices by desperate parents. He began reading them aloud. "Dear Mom and Dad, please send me a cleaning rod and bore cleaner. They don't issue them here, and my rifle keeps jamming. Some of the guys have died because their rifles stopped working. I don't want to be one of them." Another, "The M16 is a piece of junk. We were told it was self-cleaning. That's a lie. It jams constantly. I traded my rifle for an AK-47. I took off a dead VC. At least I know it will fire when I need it." The room went silent except for Eichord's voice, steady and damning. He read 16 letters over 40 minutes. Officers at the witness table stared at the table. Colt's vice president, Paul Benko, loosened his tie. Then Eichord produced photographs. 8x10 glossies, black and white, passed to each committee member. Dead Marines. Rifles disassembled beside their bodies. Stuck cases visible in chambers. The images had been taken by a Navy photographer embedded with the 3rd Marine Division. "These men," Eichord said, "died trying to clear jammed weapons while under enemy fire." Eugene Stoner took the witness chair at 14:30 hours. At 54, the rifle's designer looked exhausted. His testimony began with technical explanations. The gas system, the direct impingement design, the specifications he'd established through years of testing. Then Howard asked the question that mattered. "Mr. Stoner, are these rifles failing because your design is flawed?" Stoner's jaw tightened. "No, sir. These rifles are failing because the Army changed my design without proper testing." The room erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. Cameras flashed, despite the prohibition against photography. Stoner detailed the modifications. The elimination of chrome-lined chambers and barrels. The switch from IMR powder to ball powder. The deletion of cleaning kits from standard issue. Each change, he explained, had been made to reduce costs. Each change compromised the rifle's reliability in field conditions. "I specified chrome lining for a reason," Stoner said, his voice rising. "Vietnam is one of the most corrosive environments on Earth. Without chrome, the chambers will corrode and extraction will fail. I specified IMR powder because it burns clean. Ball powder fouls the gas system and increases chamber pressure. These weren't arbitrary choices. They were engineering requirements." Benke, representing Colt, tried to defend the company's role. They'd manufactured to Army specifications, he argued. The contracts specified ball powder compatibility. Chrome lining was optional, not mandatory in the procurement documents. "So you're saying," Howard interrupted, "that the Army ordered inferior rifles and you built them anyway?" Benke hesitated. "We built to the contract specifications, Congressman." The blame shifted like a shell game. Army procurement blamed Colt for poor quality control. Colt blamed the Army for changing specifications. The ammunition manufacturers blamed both for not coordinating propellant testing. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, soldiers were still dying. Staff Sergeant William Hayes testified in the afternoon session. He wore his dress blues, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest, and spoke in the flat, affectless tone of a man describing something beyond emotion. He told the committee about Hill 881 South, the 42% malfunction rate. The Marines who'd fixed bayonets because their rifles had become dead weight. The private who'd used an enemy AK-47 because it was more reliable than American engineering. "We were told this rifle would give us an advantage," Hayes said. "Instead, it gave the enemy an advantage. When your weapon fails in combat, you don't get a second chance. You don't get to file a complaint. You just die." A congressman asked if better training would have prevented the failures. Hayes looked at him with something approaching contempt. "Sir, you can train a man to clear a jam. You can't train a rifle to extract a stuck case when the chamber's fouled and there's no chrome lining. That's not a training problem. That's an engineering problem that someone decided wasn't worth fixing because it cost $4 extra. The hearings lasted 3 weeks. Testimony filled thousands of pages. The media coverage was relentless. Life magazine ran a cover story titled "The Rifle That Failed." Walter Cronkite devoted a segment to the scandal on CBS Evening News. The American public, already divided over Vietnam, found something to unite around. Rage at the bureaucrats who'd sent their sons to war with defective weapons. The evidence was overwhelming. The rifle could work, had worked brilliantly in early combat. But cost-cutting, bureaucratic incompetence, and failure to test modifications under field conditions had turned it into a liability. The Army's own statistics, finally released under congressional pressure, showed malfunction rates ranging from 15% in some units to over 40% in others. By July 1967, the political pressure became unstoppable. Secretary of Defense McNamara, already embattled over the war's broader failures, ordered immediate corrective action. The M16 would be fixed, or it would be replaced. No more half measures. No more cost considerations overriding performance. The directive came down like thunder. Chrome line all chambers and barrels. Switch back to proper propellant. Issue cleaning kits to every soldier. Retrain every unit. And do it now. But directives in Washington took time to reach Firebase in Vietnam. Production changes required retooling. New rifles had to be manufactured, shipped, distributed. The existing inventory, hundreds of thousands of flawed weapons, couldn't be recalled overnight, which meant soldiers would keep dying with jammed rifles in their hands while the fix made its way through the supply chain. In the hearing room, after the final gavel fell, Hayes stood in the corridor and was approached by a reporter. Did he think the changes would work? Hayes looked toward the window, toward the Vietnam Memorial that didn't exist yet but would someday bear the names of men who died on Hill 881 South. I think, he said carefully, that a lot of good men died to teach the Pentagon a lesson they should have already known. Don't send soldiers to war with weapons you haven't tested. And don't let accountants make decisions that engineers should make. The fix was coming. But redemption would have to be earned in the jungle, one firefight at a time. August 1967, Colt's manufacturing plant in Hartford, Connecticut. The production lines ran 24 hours, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. But now everything had changed. Engineering teams swarmed the facility, implementing modifications that should have been standard from the beginning. The sound of retooling echoed through the factory floor. New equipment being installed, old processes scrapped, quality control stations multiplied. Chrome plating chambers and barrels required entirely new machinery. Each barrel had to be carefully prepared, then submerged in chromium baths where electrical current bonded the metal at a molecular level. The process added 6 hours to production time per rifle. The cost savings that had justified eliminating chrome lining evaporated overnight, replaced by emergency appropriations that made the bean counters wince. In Lake City, Missouri, the Army ammunition plant underwent its own transformation. Ball powder was out. The propellant that had saved money and destroyed rifles was being replaced with powder that matched Stoner's original specifications. Every round had to be reformulated, tested, and certified. The changeover would take months, but the most visible change was simpler. Cleaning kits. They arrived in Vietnam by the tens of thousands. Small, olive drab packages containing bore brushes, cleaning rods, patches, and a comic book style manual that broke down maintenance procedures into illustrated steps. The manual's tone was almost apologetic, acknowledging that soldiers had been told the rifle was self-cleaning, then explaining why that had been catastrophically wrong. Eugene Stoner had fought one particular modification with everything he had. The forward assist, a plunger mechanism on the right side of the receiver that allowed soldiers to manually force the bolt closed if it didn't seat completely. Stoner argued it was unnecessary, that it encouraged soldiers to force rounds into fouled chambers rather than addressing the underlying problem. He lost that argument. The Army insisted soldiers in combat needed a way to ensure their rifles were in battery, even if the chamber was dirty. The forward assist became standard, a small button that would appear on every M16A1 produced thereafter. Stoner hated it, but he was no longer in control of his creation. By October 1967, the first M16A1 rifles, fully modified, chrome-lined, properly tested, began arriving in South Vietnam. They came with warning tags. This weapon requires regular cleaning. Failure to maintain will result in malfunction. The tags seemed to mock the earlier promises of a maintenance-free wonder weapon. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Molinelli, commanding 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, received a pallet of new rifles at Firebase Bastonia in November. He gathered his company commanders and made the situation clear. These are supposedly the fixed version, he said, holding up an M16A1. Chrome chambers. Proper ammunition is coming. Cleaning kits for everyone. But I want every man in this battalion to know his weapon inside and out. We're going to train like our lives depend on it, because they do. The training was exhaustive. Soldiers field stripped their rifles blindfolded. They practiced malfunction drills until muscle memory took over. They learned to clean the rifles daily, sometimes twice daily in the wet season. The gas rings, the bolt carrier, the chamber, every part that could foul, they learned to maintain, and slowly, grudgingly, the rifles began to work. Sergeant First Class Marcus Johnson, whose M16 had jammed 3 times during the Battle of Dak To in June, received a new M16A1 in December. He approached it with the wariness of a man who'd been betrayed before. For the first week, he carried his old M14 as backup. Then came a company-sized operation into the A Shau Valley, the same area where so many rifles had failed 6 months earlier. Contact came fast. North Vietnamese regulars, entrenched and waiting. Johnson went prone and opened fire. 30 rounds, 60, a full magazine change, another. The rifle ran clean. Hot brass ejected crisply. The bolt cycled without hesitation. After 300 rounds, he field stripped it and found the chamber still relatively clean. Carbon present, but nothing like the caked buildup that had plagued the earlier versions. He wrote home that week, "The new rifle works, like they said the old one would. Maybe they finally got it right." The improved ammunition began arriving in January 1968. Pallets of green ammo cans, each marked with new lot numbers and specifications. Armorers tested samples before issue, firing hundreds of rounds through bench-rested rifles while monitoring for pressure spikes and fouling. The difference was immediately apparent. Lower cyclic rate, back down to the designed 750-800 rounds per minute. Cleaner burn. Easier extraction, but skepticism ran deep. Too many soldiers had watched friends die with jammed rifles. Too many had felt the sickening click of a weapon failing at the worst possible moment. Trust, once broken, required proof to rebuild. That proof came in combat.firebase Caisson, January 21st, 1968, the opening salvos of the siege that would define the war for millions of Americans watching on television. North Vietnamese artillery hammered the base, while infantry probed the perimeter. The Marines defending Caisson were equipped almost entirely with the new M16A1s. The rifles worked. Through days of continuous combat, malfunction rates dropped to less than 2%, within acceptable tolerances for any military weapon. Soldiers who'd learned to doubt their equipment found themselves trusting it again. The rifle that had betrayed them had been reborn. Lance Corporal David Martinez, who'd survived Hill 881 South with a jammed rifle and a fixed bayonet, found himself defending the wire at Caisson with an M16A1. The contrast was surreal. He fired over 1,000 rounds during the siege. The rifle never failed, not once. "It's like having a different weapon," he told a reporter from Stars and Stripes. "Same shape, same weight. But this one works. This one keeps you alive." The psychological transformation was as important as the mechanical one. Combat effectiveness in infantry units rose measurably. Soldiers advanced with confidence rather than dread. The M16A1 was becoming what the M16 was supposed to have been all along, a force multiplier. By March 1968, the older problematic M16s were being systematically replaced. Units rotated through rear areas for retraining and reequipment. The comic book cleaning manuals became required reading. Armorer certification programs ensured every company had soldiers who could diagnose and repair issues beyond the soldier level. Eugene Stoner, watching from civilian life, felt vindicated but not triumphant. His design worked. It had always worked when built to specification. The catastrophe had been entirely preventable. Thousands of soldiers had paid the price for bureaucratic shortcuts and cost-cutting hubris. The M16A1 designation represented more than technical improvements. It represented institutional acknowledgement of failure. The A1 was an admission that the original issue rifles had been fundamentally flawed. Every soldier who picked up the new version knew that story. Some felt anger. Some felt relief. All of them felt the weight of lessons learned in blood. But there was no time for reflection. The war ground on, and now finally, American soldiers had rifles they could depend on. The transformation from failure to redemption took less than a year. The cost in lives lost during that year would never be fully calculated. The betrayal would never be fully forgiven, but the rifle worked now. And in Vietnam, that was all that mattered. January 30th, 1968. 0300 hours. Hue City, South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive began with coordinated attacks across every major city in South Vietnam. 80,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops struck simultaneously, shattering the illusion that the war was being won. And in the ancient imperial capital of Hue, the battle would become the longest and bloodiest urban combat American forces had faced since World War II. Sergeant Robert Meadows, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, woke to the sound of explosions rippling across the city. Rocket-propelled grenades, mortars, small arms fire from every direction. The North Vietnamese had infiltrated the city in civilian clothes during the holiday ceasefire, hidden weapons in safe houses, and now emerged like a tidal wave. Meadows grabbed his M16A1, one of the new rifles. Chrome-lined, properly maintained, cleaned obsessively since he'd received it 3 weeks earlier. He'd learned not to trust rifles, but this one had given him no reason to doubt. Yet, the Marines moved through the city in brutal house-to-house fighting. Urban combat was the M16's ideal environment. Close quarters, rapid engagement, the need for controllable automatic fire. The rifle's lightweight meant soldiers could maneuver through doorways and stairwells without the unwieldy bulk of heavier weapons. The 5.56mm rounds punched through interior walls and ricocheted through confined spaces with devastating effect, but it was also the ultimate test. Dust, debris, smoke, the corrosive humidity of a city on fire. Every environmental factor that had caused earlier M16s to fail was present and amplified. The rifles kept working. Meadows cleared a 3-story building on Leloy Street, moving room to room with his fire team. His M16A1 barked short bursts, 3 rounds, 4 rounds, controlled fire that put down enemy soldiers without wasting ammunition. Brass ejected cleanly. The bolts cycled without hesitation. 200 rounds into the fight, he did a combat reload and kept moving. Across the Perfume River, Private First Class James Webb, different soldier, same urban nightmare, found himself pinned in a shattered storefront by a North Vietnamese machine gun position. He'd fired over 300 rounds that day. His M16A1's barrel was hot enough to burn skin, but the weapon still functioned. He leaned around the corner, dumped a full magazine into the enemy position, reloaded, and advanced. The battle for Hue lasted 26 days, block by block, building by building, the most sustained combat most American soldiers would ever experience. And throughout it all, the M16A1 performed. Malfunction rates stayed below 3%, even under conditions that would have crippled the earlier rifles. The chrome-lined chambers handled the dust and debris. The improved ammunition burned clean enough that daily maintenance kept the rifles functional. Soldiers who'd learned to distrust the M16 found themselves depending on the M16A1. The psychological shift was profound. In earlier battles, rifle failures had created a cascade of doubt. Soldiers hesitated, checked their weapons obsessively, conserved ammunition out of fear the rifle would jam at the critical moment. At Hue, that hesitation vanished. The rifles worked. Soldiers fought with the confidence that their weapons would support them. The North Vietnamese noticed. Captured documents from the period reveal a significant tactical reassessment. One NVA after-action report recovered from a dead officer in Hue noted, American rifle performance has improved dramatically. Previous tactics exploiting weapon failures are no longer effective. Recommend increased standoff distances and heavier weapons concentration. The black rifle that had once failed American soldiers now terrified their enemies again. By mid-1968, the M16A1 had become ubiquitous across Vietnam. Production had caught up with demand. The old problematic rifles were either retrofitted or destroyed. Every new soldier arriving in country received an M16A1 and mandatory training on its care and maintenance. The weapon's reputation underwent a complete reversal. Letters Home, which had once raged about jammed rifles and betrayed trust, now praised the M16A1's reliability and effectiveness. Soldiers who'd carried enemy AK-47s as backup weapons discarded them. The M16A1 was lighter, more accurate, and finally, just as reliable. Technical innovations continued. The Army developed improved cleaning techniques. Armorers discovered that certain lubricants performed better in tropical conditions. Units experimented with firing schedules and maintenance intervals, finding the optimal balance between combat effectiveness and weapon care. But the most significant change was cultural. The M16 debacle had taught the military a harsh lesson about procurement, testing, and the cost of cutting corners. Weapons development programs were reformed. Testing protocols became more rigorous. The assumption that administrative changes wouldn't affect field performance was shattered. In the field, the transformation was visceral. Sergeant Meadows, who'd fought through Hue with an M16A1 that never failed, found himself training new arrivals in late 1968. He'd show them the rifle, demonstrate the cleaning procedure, walk them through malfunction drills. And he'd tell them the truth. This rifle will keep you alive if you take care of it, he'd say. The old ones didn't. A lot of good men died because of that. But this one works. Trust it, maintain it, and it won't let you down. The Viet Cong and NVA adapted their tactics accordingly. Ambush distances increased. Standoff engagements with mortars and rockets replaced close-quarters firefights when possible. The calculus had shifted. American infantry, properly armed, were too dangerous to engage directly unless absolutely necessary. North Vietnamese training documents captured in 1969 reflected this shift. One manual, translated by Army intelligence, instructed soldiers to avoid prolonged engagement with American rifle units. Their sustained fire capability exceeds our capacity to suppress it. Use heavy weapons and withdraw. The rifle that had once given the enemy an advantage now forced them to change their entire approach to combat. By 1970, the M16A1 was simply the rifle to American soldiers. The designation, the history, the scandal, all of it faded into institutional memory. New soldiers had never known the earlier failures. They'd heard stories, maybe, but the weapon in their hands worked exactly as promised. The redemption was complete. But the men who'd fought with jammed rifles in 1967 never forgot. They'd earned the right to trust the M16A1 through survival. The price of that trust was measured in friends who died holding weapons that had failed them. Lieutenant Colonel Molinelli, who'd overseen the retraining of his battalion with M16A1s, rotated home in 1969. Before he left, he addressed his troops one final time. "The rifle you're carrying now is not the rifle we started with," he said. "Some of you don't remember the old ones. Be grateful for that. The men who do remember paid a terrible price to get you the weapon you have now. Honor that. Maintain your rifle. Trust it. But never forget that trust has to be earned. And the M16 earned yours the hard way. In the jungle, in the cities, across the rice paddies and mountains of Vietnam, the M16A1 had proven itself. The weapon that had been America's greatest procurement failure had become one of its most effective infantry rifles. The transformation was complete. What remained was the reckoning with what it had cost, the National Infantry Museum, Fort Moore, Georgia. Present day. Behind climate-controlled glass sits an M16A1 rifle, serial number 36549. The plastic furniture is scratched and faded. The barrel shows wear from thousands of rounds. A small placard identifies it as having served with the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, during the Battle of Hue City, 1968. The plaque doesn't mention the controversy. It doesn't talk about jammed rifles or congressional hearings or the soldiers who died with stuck brass in their chambers. It just says the rifle served with distinction. The numbers tell a more complete story. Between 1965 and 1967, during the height of the M16 malfunction crisis, estimated casualties directly attributable to rifle failures numbered in the hundreds. Some analysts place the figure higher. The exact count will never be known. Official records are incomplete. And many deaths were attributed to enemy action, without noting that the soldier had been trying to clear a jammed weapon when killed. But the survivors know. They carry that knowledge like shrapnel lodged too close to vital organs to remove. The failure rates themselves are well documented. Early M16s malfunctioned at rates ranging from 15 to 40+%, depending on unit, location, and environmental conditions. The M16A1, after modifications, brought that rate down to under 2%, comparable to or better than any contemporary military rifle. The transformation took 11 months from the congressional hearings to widespread M16A1 deployment, 11 months during which soldiers fought with weapons they couldn't fully trust. The psychological cost of that period can't be quantified in statistics. The institutional changes were sweeping and permanent. The M16 scandal fundamentally altered how the U.S. military approached weapons procurement. Testing protocols were expanded to include extended field trials under combat conditions. The assumption that cost-saving modifications wouldn't impact performance was replaced with rigorous verification requirements. And perhaps most importantly, soldier feedback was taken seriously rather than dismissed as user error. The changes came too late for men like Private Danny Kowalski, killed at A Shao Valley when his rifle jammed during the opening seconds of an ambush. Too late for the Marines who fixed bayonets on Hill 881 South because their rifles had become clubs. Too late for hundreds of others whose names are carved into the Vietnam veterans. Memorial. Eugene Stoner died in 1997. He never fully reconciled with the way his design had been compromised and later vindicated. In later interviews, he spoke carefully about the M16's troubled introduction, acknowledging the technical problems while defending the fundamental soundness of his design. He was right to defend it. The M16 platform, properly built and maintained, proved to be one of the most effective infantry rifles ever fielded. The M16A1 served as the standard U.S. military rifle until 1982, when the improved M16A2 entered service. The A2 version incorporated 3-round burst control, improved sights, and further refinements. In 1994, the M4 carbine, a shortened, modernized descendant of Stoner's original design, began replacing the M16 for most combat units. Today, over 60 years after Stoner first designed the AR-15, variants of the platform remain in frontline service. The U.S. military is only now beginning to transition to a different rifle system. No other American infantry rifle has served for so long, or in such numbers. That longevity validates Stoner's design brilliance, but it doesn't erase the betrayal of 1966 and 1967. Staff Sergeant William Hayes, who testified at the congressional hearings about Hill 881 South, retired from the Marine Corps in 1986. He spent decades working with veteran organizations, advocating for recognition of the M16 crisis and its impact on soldiers. In interviews, he remained measured but unforgiving. "The rifle works now," he said in a 2015 oral history. "It's worked for a long time, but there was a period where it didn't, and men died because of decisions made by people who never had to carry it in combat. That's what bothers me. Not the engineering problems, those can be fixed. But the indifference to soldiers' lives in the name of saving money, that's harder to forgive." The M16A1 that sits in the Fort Moore Museum served without failure through 26 days of urban combat at Hue. The soldier who carried it, Lance Corporal David Martinez, survived the battle, completed his tour, and returned home. He donated the rifle to the museum in 1995 with a single condition, that it be displayed exactly as it was, wear and scratches intact. "I want people to see a rifle that worked," Martinez explained at the donation ceremony. "Because a lot of us carried rifles that didn't. This one kept me alive. It deserves to be remembered." The legacy of the M16 is complex and contradictory. It's a story of brilliant engineering compromised by bureaucratic incompetence, of technological promise betrayed by cost-cutting, of institutional failure followed by successful reform, and, ultimately, of a weapon system that overcame its catastrophic introduction to become one of the most successful military rifles in history. But for the men who fought in Vietnam between 1965 and 1967, the legacy is simpler and more personal. They remember the rifle that failed them. Some of them later learned to trust the rifle that didn't. Others never carried an M16 again, requesting M14s or other weapons whenever possible. The trauma of betrayal doesn't heal with technical fixes. Trust, once shattered, leaves scars even after it's rebuilt. In veteran gatherings and online forums, soldiers who served during the crisis years still share stories. The specific details vary. Different units, different battles, different outcomes. But the core narrative remains constant. The rifle failed. Friends died. Someone should have been held accountable. No one was. The congressional hearings resulted in procurement reforms and technical corrections, but no criminal charges, no court-martials, no personal consequences for the men who authorized the cost-cutting measures that killed American soldiers. That, perhaps, is the deepest wound. The institutional acknowledgement that mistakes were made, combined with the institutional refusal to hold individuals responsible. The system failed. The system corrected itself. And the men who died during the failure became statistics and reports about improved reliability rates. The M16's journey from promise to catastrophe to redemption took less than 3 years. The rifle that terrified the North Vietnamese then failed American soldiers, then redeemed itself through engineering corrections, remains in service worldwide. Over 8 million M16s and variants have been produced. The platform has seen combat in every American conflict since Vietnam. It works now. It's worked for decades. The lessons learned from its failure have improved military procurement across every weapon system. The institutional memory of the M16 crisis influences decisions to this day. But walk through the Fort Moore Museum and find that M16A1 behind glass, and you're looking at more than a rifle. You're looking at a testament to the cost of cutting corners, a reminder that weapons development has human consequences, a memorial to the soldiers who paid the price for bureaucratic failure. Wars are won by soldiers. Technology shapes battles. Engineering determines outcomes. But in the end, the story of the M16 is about trust, promised, betrayed, and painfully rebuilt. The rifle works now because men died proving it didn't. That's the truth they don't put on museum placards. That's the legacy written in brass casings stuck in unlined chambers, in carbon fouling from the wrong propellant, in the scratches on a rifle that finally worked the way it was supposed to. The M16 was redeemed. The men who died to force that redemption were not. Their names are on memorials. Their stories are in archives. Their rifles, when they work, are behind glass. If you want more stories where technology, tragedy, and courage collide, where the decisions made in offices determine who lives and dies in jungles, subscribe to our channel for untold chapters of war, sacrifice, and the brutal lessons learned when promises meet reality.